The dark water of the Sea of Japan parted like oil before the knife edge of the USS Barb's bow, a silent, steel predator gliding just beneath the surface. Above, a sliver of moon cast a feeble silvered path across the swells, illuminating nothing and yet revealing everything, the infinite, empty expanse of their hunting grounds. Inside the submarine, the air was a thick, palpable stew of diesel fumes, sweat and a tension so acute it felt like a physical presence, a fifth crew member haunting the narrow passageways. This tension was the birthright of the hunter-killer, a vessel whose very existence was a testament to audacity. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood motionless before the chart table in the conning tower, his lean frame illuminated by the soft red glow of a battle lamp. His fingers, steady and sure, traced a course along the coast of Honshu, a route already stained with the ghostly echoes of past engagements. In the quiet hum of the boat, his mind drifted back to the chaos of the Formosa Strait, to the night they had slipped inside a heavily guarded convoy. The memory was a sensory ghost, the acrid smell of cordite hanging in the air after the torpedoes had left their tubes, the concussive whump of impacts, felt through the deck plates, the distant orange fireballs that had bloomed against the black horizon as a Japanese tanker and its escort were torn apart. That sinking and a dozen others like it had not just been victories. They had been statements. They had forged the Barb's reputation and cemented Fluckey's own as a commander of relentless, almost reckless aggression. His crew moved around him with the quiet efficiency of men who had been tempered in the same fire. A sonarman, headphones clamped over his ears, listened to the deep silence of the sea, his brow furrowed in concentration, searching for the telltale ping of an enemy screw or the faint thrum of a distant engine. In the control room, a helmsman's hands rested lightly on the wheel, his steady eyes fixed on the depth gauge, holding the boat in perfect trim. There were no wasted movements, no unnecessary sounds. Each man was a component in a complex, deadly machine, and the machine's heart was the calm, calculating presence of its captain. Fluckey's gaze lifted from the charts, from the penciled-in tracks of past patrols and the red circles marking known minefields, to sweep over his men. He saw the set of a young torpedoman's jaw, tight with suppressed adrenaline. He noted the veteran chief's impassive face, a mask that hid a deep well of experience and fatigue. This was the reality of their war, not the brief, violent explosions of combat, but the long, draining hours of waiting, of stalking, of holding one's nerve in a pressurized steel tube surrounded by an ocean that offered no mercy. They were pirates in a metal shell, ghosts in the deep, and their success was measured not just in tonnage sent to the bottom, but in the sheer, unwavering nerve required to return, again and again, to the enemy's doorstep. Under the moonlit sea, the hunter was on the prowl once more. The coded message arrived in the dead of night, a stream of encrypted gibberish that, when deciphered in the radio shack, became a set of orders so audacious they felt more like a page from a dime store adventure novel than a naval directive. The paper, still warm from the decoding machine, was placed into Commander Fluckey's hand. He read it once. Then again, his expression not changing, though a new, sharp light kindled in his eyes. The Barb, the hunter of the deep, was being ordered to become a saboteur on land. Their target was the railway line on the coast of Japanese-held Sakhalin. They were to go ashore and blow up a train. Within the hour, the submarine's officers were gathered in the cramped, red-lit wardroom. The air, already thick with the scent of stale coffee and damp wool, now crackled with a new, electric energy. Fluckey stood at the head of the small table, the single sheet of orders lying before him like a declaration of war against conventional wisdom. He outlined the mission with a surgeon's calm precision, his voice a low, steady monotone that belied the sheer insanity of the plan. He spoke of navigating close to a hostile shore, of launching rubber boats under the cover of darkness, of landing a party of men on an enemy beach to plant explosives on a heavily trafficked railway line. Around the table, the reactions were a study in contrasts. The junior officers, men whose faces still held the eager sharpness of the academy, leaned forward, their eyes alight with a fierce, almost boyish excitement. One lieutenant, his fingers drumming a silent, nervous tattoo on the tabletop, could not suppress a grin at the sheer bravado of it. This was the kind of mission they had dreamed of, a story to tell their grandchildren. But the more seasoned men, the executive officer and the chief engineer, exchanged a long, weighted glance. They saw past the thrill to that cold, hard arithmetic of risk. They saw the patrol boats that would surely be prowling the coastline, the searchlights that would sweep the black water, the countless Japanese soldiers stationed mere miles from their proposed landing site. Fluckey acknowledged his dangers without flinching, his calm a bulwark against the rising tide of anxiety. He spoke of stealth, of moving like shadows, of using the terrain and the enemy's own complacency as their primary weapons. This would not be a head-on assault, but a surgical strike, an act of piracy conducted on solid ground. It required not just courage, but a profound capacity for improvisation. There were no charts for this, no established protocols for a submarine crew turning itself into a commando unit. Every step, from the landing to the placement of the charge to the withdrawal, would be an exercise in on-the-fly adaptation. The stakes were monumental, a fact that hung unspoken in the close air of the wardroom. Failure meant more than a botched mission. It meant capture, interrogation, and almost certain execution for the men on the beach. It could mean the loss of the Barb herself, caught in shallow water with her crew exposed. Yet, as Fluckey's steady gaze swept the room, his calculated calm began to seep into the others, tempering the junior officer's excitement and steadying the veteran's nerves. He was not asking them to ignore the danger, but to master it. He was proposing they write their own chapter in the annals of naval warfare, a chapter that would be defined not by the weight of the steel they sank, but by the sheer, breathtaking nerve required to bring the war to the enemy's shore. The proposition was on the table, but dare whispered in the heart of a submarine, and the silence that followed was filled with the thunder of its implications. The selection process began, not with a formal announcement, but with a series of quiet summonses, delivered in hushed tones throughout the boat. One by one, men were called to the commander's tiny, chart-cluttered stateroom, a space that smelled of ozone, ink, and the faint metallic scent of the sea. Commander Fluckey conducted the interviews himself, his posture relaxed in his chair, his eyes missing nothing. He was not just assessing skills listed on service records, he was gauging the metal behind the eyes, the steadiness of hands, the unspoken quality of nerve that no document could capture. He needed men who could carry the weight of silence, who understood that the slightest misstep on a foreign beach could mean a cascade of disaster for them all. The first to enter was motor machinists, Mate Billy Hatfield, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands, and a calm, methodical demeanor that belied his youth. Fluckey questioned him not about engines, but about his experience with small boats, about his ability to keep a temperamental outboard motor running in freezing surf under the threat of discovery. Hatfield's answers were direct, his confidence born of countless hours spent tinkering in the Barb's sweltering engine room. He was the obvious choice to command the rubber boats, a man who understood machinery as an extension of his own will. Next came Paul Saunders, the torpedoman whose expertise with explosives was the stuff of boat legend. In the stateroom, Fluckey laid out the schematic for pressure-triggered charge, a device that required no timer, only the weight of a train to complete its deadly circuit. Saunders studied it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the imagined wiring with a delicate, almost artistic precision. He looked up and gave a single slow nod, his eyes alight with a craftsman's understanding. He would be the one to arm the bomb, to nestle destruction against the cold steel of the rails, and make it look like a part of the landscape itself. The interviews continued, each man bringing a crucial piece to the puzzle. The signalman with the sharp eyes of a hawk was chosen as the lead scout, his ability to read terrain in near-total darkness deemed indispensable. A burly gunner's mate, selected for his sheer physical strength, would carry the bulk of the explosives and the collapsible rubber boat. The final man chosen was the navigator, a young officer with a preternatural sense of direction who would be responsible for guiding them back to the exact spot on the bleak, featureless coast where the Barb would be waiting. They were no longer just submariners. They were a unit apart, bound by a shared, secret purpose. In the forward torpedo room, amidst the looming shapes of the dormant fish, they began their preparations. The air, thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and cold metal, was punctuated by whispered jokes and the easy, gallows humor camaraderie of men facing a long odds. A raider testing the edge of his combat knife quipped that he hoped to use it for cutting salami back in California, not for anything more serious on a Japanese beach. Another, checking the seals on his inflatable boat, muttered about the water temperature and wondered aloud if the Navy would charge him for a lost boat if he had to swim home. Through it all, Fluckey observed, a silent architect watching his creation take form. He saw the way Saunders patiently explained the fusing mechanism to the others, his quiet authority building a web of trust. He watched Hatfield and the navigator hunched over a coastal chart, their heads close together, tracing potential routes inland and back, with a shared intensity. This was not a collection of individuals, but an organism, each man a vital organ, relying on the others to function. Their trust was not given lightly. It was forged in the shared understanding of the abyss they were about to skirt. In the claustrophobic belly of the submarine, surrounded by the tools of deep-water war, 8 men prepared to become soldiers on land. Their success hinging entirely on the invisible bonds of teamwork and the unshakable nerve their commander had seen glowing within them. The USS Barb became a ghost, a sliver of black steel sliding through the ink-dark waters off Carafuto. Every non-essential system was shut down, the great diesel engines silenced, the crew moving through her passages with the deliberate, soundless caution of men walking through a room of sleeping giants. The only sounds were the subtle, internal rhythms of the boat itself, the faint hum of the electric motors, the whisper of the ventilation, the occasional muffled clink of a tool from the forward torpedo room, where the raiders made their final preparations. Outside the pressure hull, the cold sea whispered against the plates, a constant, chilling reminder of the world they were invading. In the forward compartment, the 8 chosen men worked by the dim glow of battle lamps, their faces etched with concentration. The air was thick with the smell of rubber and salt water as they unrolled and inspected the inflatable boats, their hands checking every seam and valve for the slightest imperfection. Paddles, bundled in dark cloth to prevent any telltale clatter, were laid out in neat rows. Each man's personal gear was scrutinized, blackened faces, with grease paint, weapons with taped-down parts to eliminate noise, and the heavy canvas-wrapped blocks of composition C that constituted their deadly cargo. The demolitions expert, Paul Saunders, moved among the packs, his touch lingering on the explosives, a final silent communion with the tools of their mission. Up in the conning tower, Commander Fluckey stood with the officer of the deck, their eyes fixed on the periscope. The world outside was a study in monochrome. The gibbous moon cast a weak silver light upon the choppy water, illuminating the crests of the waves, but leaving the troughs in profound darkness. It was this interplay of light and shadow that was their greatest ally and their most formidable enemy. The moonlit surf crashed against a distant unseen shore, a rhythmic roar that masked their own sounds, but also outlined their silhouette for any watchful eye. Every few minutes, Fluckey would sweep the horizon, his knuckles white on the periscope handles, searching for the dark, low shape of a patrol boat or the telltale smoke of a coastal freighter. The tension was a wire pull taut through the entire boat. In the control room, the plainsmen held the Barb at periscope depth with an almost supernatural stillness, their eyes locked on the depth gauges. The sonar, isolated in his world of headphones, listened to the underwater symphony of shrimp clicks and whale song, straining to pick out the malignant mechanical heartbeat of an enemy propeller. The wait was agonizing, a test of collective nerve where a single cough or a dropped wrench could spell doom. It was in this pressurized silence that a young sailor, helping to secure a rubber boat, let out a low, nervous whisper to the man next to him. His joke was about the frigid temperature of the water, a morbid observation that, if their boat was holed, they wouldn't have to worry about the Japanese patrols for long. The hypothermia would claim them long before they could even think about swimming home. The whispered words hung in the air, a stark articulation of the stakes. No one laughed, but a few men offered grim, understanding nods. The joke was not meant to be funny. It was a release valve, a way of giving voice to the shared, chilling fear that coiled in every gut. It underscored the sheer audacity of their venture. They were submariners, men of the deep, preparing to risk everything on a hostile shore, where the cold was as much an enemy as the soldiers who patrolled it. The Barb crept on, a silent hunter transformed into a vulnerable delivery vehicle, carrying its precious cargo of 8 men and their fragile nerve toward the moonlit waiting coast. The transition from the steel womb of the submarine to the fragile skin of the rubber boats was a descent into a new, more intimate kind of vulnerability. The USS Barb lay just below the surface, a brooding leviathan holding its breath as the forward hatch hissed open to the frigid night. One by one, the 8 raiders emerged into the biting air, their blackened faces turned toward the unseen shore. The inflatable boats already lowered into the choppy water, bobbed like discarded shadows beside the great dark hull. Each man moved with a slow, deliberate grace, lowering himself into the cramped craft, his every sense screaming in the vast, open darkness. The world had expanded from the close, metallic confines of the boat to an infinite expanse of sea and sky, and they were now exposed at its mercy. The paddles dipped into the water with a silence born of intense practice, the cloth-wrapped blades making barely a whisper as they bit into the swells. The 2 boats, looking like little more than drifting debris, began their slow, arduous crawl toward the black line of the coast. The rhythmic crash of the surf grew from a distant rumble to a deafening roar, a natural curtain of sound that masked their approach, but also heralded the first great obstacle. The moon, playing a fickle game of hide-and-seek behind scudding clouds, would periodically bathe the scene in a pale, treacherous light, illuminating the white froth of the breaking waves. In those moments, the men in the boats would freeze, becoming statues, their hearts hammering against their ribs, willing themselves to be invisible. Their progress was a battle against the elements. The cold sea spray stung their faces like shards of glass, and the frigid water that slushed into the boat soaked through their uniforms, leaching the warmth from their bodies with a ruthless efficiency. Their muscles burned with the strain of fighting the current, each pull of the paddle feeling like it gained only inches. The lead boat, commanded by Hatfield, commanded by Hatfield, navigated by instinct and the faint, darker silhouette of the land, its occupants scanning the shoreline for the specific featureless patch of beach they had memorized from the charts. Suddenly, a brilliant, searching eye of light stabbed out from the darkness to the north. A Japanese patrol boat, its engine alow, growing from they could now feel through the water, was sweeping the coastline with a powerful searchlight. The beam swept across the water, a blade of pure white that turned the Black Sea to liquid mercury. The raiders stopped paddling, letting the boats drift, their bodies pressed low against the cold, wet rubber. The light passed over them, so close they could see the individual droplets of water glittering in its beam. For a heart-stopping eternity they were pinned in its glare, certain that the silhouette of a man or the curve of a boat would betray them. They held their breath, their world reduced to the blinding eye, and the thunder of their own blood in their ears. Then the beam swept on, continuing its methodical search farther down the coast, leaving them in a darkness that felt deeper and more protective than before. The patrol boat's engine noise faded, swallowed by the surf's roar. No one spoke. No signal was given. They simply picked up their paddles again and resumed their slow, nerve-shredding crawl toward the enemy shore, the close call having forged their resolve into something harder and sharper than steel. They had passed the first test, their silence and stillness their only weapons, and the black beach of Karafuto now loomed before them, a threshold to a world of even greater peril. The black sand of the beach felt like a reprieve, yet it was only the beginning. Leaving the rubber boats carefully concealed beneath a tangle of driftwood and dark kelp, the 8 raiders turned their faces inland, where the true test awaited. The terrain rose sharply from the shoreline, a ragged wall of darkness choked with gnarled pines and dense undergrowth. The distant, rhythmic crash of the surf faded behind them, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the scuff of their boots on rocky soil and the occasional, sharp intake of breath. The air itself felt different, heavier, laced with the damp, earthy scent of pine needles and decay, a stark contrast to the salty tang of the sea. They moved in a single file column, a chain of shadows flowing through deeper shadow. The lead scout, a Fenton in the gloom, set a punishing pace, his eyes constantly scanning the indistinct shapes of the forest ahead. Every few yards he would raise a clenched fist, and the entire column would freeze, melting into the landscape as one organism. In these moments of absolute stillness, the sounds of the night would reassert themselves, the rustle of some small creature in the brush, the sigh of the wind through the pine boughs, and then, faint but unmistakable, the sound that was the entire purpose of their existence. It was a low, mournful whistle carried on the wind from the east, followed by the faint, metallic rumble of a train moving along its track. The sound was a ghost, a promise of the destruction they had come to deliver, and it sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through every man. The journey inland was a brutal contest against the land itself. The ground was uneven, littered with hidden roots and loose stones that threatened to turn an ankle with every step. Thick, clawing branches snatched at their clothing and equipment, and more than once, a man had to bite back a curse as a thorny vine ripped at his exposed skin. Their progress was measured not in miles, but in painful, hard-won yards. Communication was reduced to the barest essentials: a touch on the shoulder, a series of hand signals relayed down the line, the occasional hissed warning about a patch of loose gravel, or a sudden drop. Their world had shrunk to the man in front of them, and the man behind, the shared burden of their heavy packs, and the ever-present, gnawing awareness of the enemy who might be lurking behind any tree. After what felt like an eternity of grueling ascent, the lead scout at the head of the column suddenly dropped to one knee, his silhouette rigid against the slightly less dark sky. The signal to halt passed instantly back through the line. Every man dropped into a crouch, weapons held ready, breaths held. The scout remained motionless for a long minute, his head cocked, listening. Then he turned and crept back down the line, his movements fluid and silent, until he reached Commander Fluckey and the navigator. He pointed a single, steady finger through a break in the trees ahead. There, snaking through a shallow cut in the landscape, was a pair of gleaming, parallel lines. The railway. In the faint ambient light, the steel rails caught what little illumination there was, forming two perfect silver threads that vanished into the darkness in both directions. The sight of it was both a triumph and a terror. They had reached their objective, a feat of navigation and endurance against the brutal terrain. But the sight of the exposed track, so clean and orderly in the wild landscape, underscored the immense danger of the next phase. They were now in the heart of the enemy's territory, mere feet from a vital artery, and the precision required for what came next was absolute. A single misplaced footstep, a careless reflection from a piece of equipment, a sound carried on the wrong gust of wind any of it could bring, the entire weight of the Japanese garrison down upon them. The distant train whistle sounded again, closer this time, a grim reminder that time was now a luxury they did not possess. The looming danger was no longer an abstract concept. It was a set of cold, hard rails waiting for the kiss of their explosives. The gleam of the railway tracks was a siren's call, drawing them from the protective cloak of the forest into a zone of stark exposure. The raiders emerged from the tree line like wraiths materializing from shadow, their movements slow and deliberate, each step a calculated risk. The air over the rail bed felt different, charged with an invisible current of danger. The two steel ribbons, laid with geometric precision across the rough earth, were more than just a target. They were a conduit for the enemy's might, and to touch them was to invite instant retribution. The team fanned out, a perimeter of watchful sentries melting into the scrub on either side of the track, their weapons pointed outward, their eyes straining against the darkness for any sign of movement. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind and the frantic beating of their own hearts. In the center of this defensive ring, Paul Saunders and Commander Fluckey knelt beside the rails. Saunders unshouldered his pack with the reverence of a priest preparing a sacrament, laying it gently on the gravel bed. From within, he extracted the components of their vengeance, several blocks of composition C, pliable and dense, a spool of insulated wire, and the pressure trigger mechanism, a deceptively simple-looking device of springs and contacts that held the power of an avalanche within its small, metal casing. This was the heart of their plan, the ingenious non-timer that Fluckey had championed. It required no clock, no delicate calculation of a trained schedule. It was a patient predator, one that would wait silently, for days if necessary, until its specific prey, the immense weight of a locomotive, arrived to spring the trap. Saunders' hands, steady despite the cold and the crushing weight of the moment, began their work. He molded the putty-like explosives around the junction of a rail and a heavy wooden tie, his touch gentle, shaping the charge into an innocuous, dirt-colored lump that would be invisible to any but the most meticulous inspection. The tension was a physical force, coiling tighter with every passing second. Each small sound, the soft crinkle of the waxed paper wrapping, the faint click of the trigger mechanism being armed, the whisper of wire unspooling, seemed to echo like a gunshot in the vast, silent landscape. Every man on the perimeter flinched inwardly at these tiny noises, their grips tightening on their weapons, their gazes sweeping the impenetrable darkness with a fresh, raw intensity. Fluckey watched Saunders, his own breathing shallow, his entire being focused on the demolitions expert's every movement. This was the crucible of the mission, the point where audacious planning met fragile, painstaking execution. The ingenuity of the pressure trigger was also its greatest vulnerability. Its installation was a delicate, hands-on process, requiring minutes of exposed, unmoving work in the one place the enemy was guaranteed to patrol. A single misplaced wire, a spring set with too much or too little tension, and the charge would be a dud, or worse, detonate prematurely. The success of their entire daring shore raid, the risk to the T, Barb and her crew, all hinged on the perfection of this one small device being wired into the iron road under the cover of a fickle night. The darkness was their only shield, and it felt terrifyingly thin. With the main charge nestled against the rail like a malevolent growth, the final, most dangerous phase of the wiring began. Paul Saunders's hands, still impossibly steady, began paying out the insulated wire, leading it away from the track in a shallow, carefully dug trench. The spool turned with a faint, gritty whisper, the wire itself a dark serpent slithering through the gravel and dirt. Another raider, crawling on his belly, followed behind, using his hands to sweep loose soil and dead leaves over the thin line, erasing its presence from the world. Their movements were a synchronized ballet of concealment, each man an extension of the other, their shared purpose a silent mantra against the rising tide of fear. The wire had to be hidden from a casual glance, yet remain functional, a buried nerve waiting to transmit the signal of its own destruction. They had laid perhaps 20 feet of the connection when the world around them froze. From the north, carried on a sudden shift of the wind, came the unmistakable rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. It was not the distant, imagined threat of a patrol, but the immediate, closing reality of one. A single sharp hiss from the perimeter sentry acted as a lightning rod for the team's collective will. In an instant, every man became a part of the earth. Saunders and the man burying the wire flattened themselves into the shallow depression they had just created, pressing their faces into the cold, damp soil. The sentries on the flanks melted deeper into the undergrowth, their bodies contorted into shapes of shadow and rock, their weapons held tight, fingers resting on cold triggers. The sound of the patrol grew a dozen pairs of boots, marching in a loose, unhurried rhythm. The faint glow of cigarette tips bobbed in the darkness, and the low, guttural murmur of Japanese conversation drifted toward the paralyzed raiders. The soldiers were close, so close that the Americans could smell the faint, acrid scent of their tobacco and hear the rustle of their uniforms. The patrol was walking along the railway embankment itself, their path taking them directly toward the very spot where the charge was hidden and the two men lay buried in the earth. Time stretched into an agonizing, rubbery band. Each crunch of a boot heel was a hammer blow against their nerves. A stray glance, a kicked stone revealing the freshly turned earth, a glint of moonlight on a forgotten tool. Any of it would mean discovery, a firefight against impossible odds, and the end of everything. As the lead Japanese soldier's boots passed within 10 feet of the hidden charge, one of the raiders, a young gunner's mate pressed into a thicket of brambles, felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat, born of sheer, unbearable tension. He fought it down, but the impulse translated into action. With glacial slowness, He turned his head just enough to catch the eye of the man next to him. In a whisper so faint, it was little more than a shaped breath, he let out a single gallows humor line. "Hope their train's on time," he breathed, the words vanishing almost before they were spoken. "I forgot to pack a lunch. In the context of the paralyzing fear, the whispered joke was an absurdity, a tiny spark of insanity in the overwhelming darkness. No one smiled. No one even moved. But the effect was profound. The shared, unspoken acknowledgement of their predicament, framed in the familiar language of their boat's dark humor, acted as a release. It was a reminder that they were still a crew, still the men who had joked in the torpedo room, bound together not just by duty, but by a shared, grim camaraderie. The tension did not vanish, but it became something manageable, a tool to be wielded rather than a force to be feared. The Japanese patrol continued on, their voices and footsteps fading into the night, completely unaware of the 8 ghosts they had passed, or the explosive secret lying inches from their path. As the sound of the enemy finally disappeared, the raiders remained frozen for a full minute more, the stakes of their exposure and the strength of their bond reinforced in the chilling silence left behind. Every second on the enemy shore was a borrowed one, a fragile gift from the receding darkness. With the pressure-triggered charge buried and wired, its lethal promise sleeping beneath the gravel, the 8 raiders did not linger to admire their handiwork. A single, sharp hand signal from Commander Fluckey set them in motion. A phantom column retreating from the iron road and melting back into the waiting embrace of the forest. The journey back was a mirror of their advance, but inverted, haunted by the knowledge of what they had left behind. Every shadow now seemed to hold a watching eye, every rustle in the undergrowth, the prelude to a shouted challenge. The tension which had been a sharp, focused tool during the planting now became a diffuse, gnawing dread that clung to them like the damp chill of their uniforms. They moved with a heightened urgency, their pace faster now, driven by the primal need to put distance between themselves and the railway. The terrain that had been a brutal obstacle on the way in now felt like a treacherous ally, its uneven ground and grasping branches offering concealment, but also threatening to betray them with a misplaced step or a snapped twig. Their ears, still ringing from the proximity of the Japanese patrol, were tuned to an almost supernatural acuity, filtering the natural sounds of the night for any that were man-made and menacing. The distant, mournful cry of a train whistle, the very sound they had come to summon, now sent a fresh jolt of ice through their veins, a reminder that their window of escape was measured in the sound, intervals between patrols and the schedule of the rails. Reaching the crest of the rise that overlooked the shore felt like crossing a threshold. Below them, the black expanse of the sea stretched to the horizon, its surface a chaotic pattern of moonlit silver and inky troughs. The rhythmic crash of the surf was no longer a mask for their approach, but a siren song of potential safety. Yet, the beach itself was a new killing field, an open expanse of sand that had to be crossed under the fickle gaze of the moon. They paused at the tree line, a row of spectral figures, scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. Seeing nothing but the endless, white-frothed waves, they broke from cover and descended the slope in a low, scrambling crouch, their dark forms flowing like oil across the pale sand. The relief of finding their rubber boats undisturbed, still hidden beneath the driftwood and kelp, was a physical sensation, a loosening of the wire-tight coil in every chest. But there was no time for celebration. With practiced, silent efficiency, they dragged the heavy, waterlogged crafts into the surf. the icy water shocking their exhausted bodies back to full alertness. As they clambered aboard and their paddles bit into the churning water, a new kind of tension took hold. The delicate, heart-pounding suspense of the final escape. Each pull of the paddle took them farther from the shore, but also exposed them more fully on the open water, small black specks against the vast, shimmering sea. A mile out, the periscope of the USS Barb broke the surface, a single, unblinking eye watching their progress. Inside the conning tower, Commander Fluckey's face was pressed against the rubber eyepiece, his knuckles white as he tracked the two tiny, struggling dots. His own relief at seeing them was tempered by a cold, calculating fear. They were at their most vulnerable now, caught between the hostile shore and the safety of the boat. Perfectly visible from the coast, if any. Searchlights should stab out into the darkness. The success of the entire audacious raid, the lives of his 8 best men, all hinged on these final agonizing minutes of their paddle across the moonlit water. The delicacy of their escape was a tangible thing, a soap bubble of fortune drifting on a sea of peril, and he held his breath, willing them onward, a silent sentinel guiding his ghosts home. The final, straining heave over the side was a rebirth, a violent transition from the exposed, freezing world of the rubber boats back into the steel and oil reality of the submarine. Strong, eager hands reached down from the Barb's slick deck, hauling each of the 8 raiders out of the churning, black water and into the tight, frantic embrace of their crewmates. The greetings were wordless, a language of hard, backslapping hugs and fierce, relieved grips on shoulders, faces split with grins that were as much about survival as success. The raiders, their bodies, trembling with a combination of exhaustion, adrenaline, and the deep, bone-numbing cold, were half carried, half dragged through the forward hatch. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind the last man, a sound more beautiful than any symphony, sealing them off from the enemy sea and the perilous night. The moment the hatch dogged shut, the atmosphere inside the submarine transformed. The tense, waiting silence shattered into a controlled, purposeful frenzy. The raiders, shedding their soaked sandy gear in the cramped torpedo room, were surrounded by their crew, who pressed cups of scalding coffee into their shaking hands and wrapped them in thick wool blankets. The air thick with the familiar smells of diesel, sweat, and cooking was a welcome assault on their senses after the clean, brutal chill of the outside world. But the reunion was brutally short, even as the men tried to form words to articulate the experience of the shore. Commander Fluckey was there, his presence a calming, centering force in the chaos. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over the 8 faces, counting, ensuring they were all whole. He herded them toward the wardroom, a tight procession of dripping, shivering men moving through the narrow passageways. The quick debrief was a necessity, a stripping away of the mission's emotional shell to get at the hard, tactical core. Fluckey stood at the head of the small table, his voice low and steady as he fired off questions in a rapid staccato. Had they been seen? Was the charge properly set? Were there any changes to the patrol patterns? The raiders, their minds still hazy with fatigue, answered in clipped factual phrases, their words painting a stark picture of the close call with the patrol and the flawless placement of the explosive. There was no time for embellishment, no room for the fear that still flickered behind their eyes. The information was extracted, processed, and filed away in the span of a few minutes. Even as the last report was given, a new tension began to coil through the boat. The order was passed, quietly but with absolute authority. Prepare to dive. The relief of the raiders' return was instantly subsumed by the immediate practical demands of survival. The crew, Their brief moment of celebration over, snapped back into their roles with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The hollow clang of the diving alarm being tested echoed through the compartments. The raiders, dismissed from the debrief, stumbled to their stations or were guided to spare bunks, their part in the drama over for now, their fate once again tied to the skill of the men who ran the submarine. Standing in the control room, watching the crew prepare to take the Barb deep, Commander Fluckey was a portrait of conflicting emotions. A fierce, primal satisfaction warmed his core. His men were back. They had done the impossible. Landing on a hostile shore, planting their charge, and returning without a single casualty. It was a testament to their training, their nerve, and the sheer audacity of the plan. But as he watched the helmsman's hands on the wheel and listened to the chief relay depth checks, a cold knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. The most dangerous part of the mission was now upon them. They were a stationary target, hovering just off the enemy coast, waiting for a detonation that would announce their presence to every Japanese warship within 50 miles. The waiting game had begun, and the pressure of leadership settled on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a cold, sharp focus. The success of the raid was no longer about explosives on a rail line. It was about getting his boat and his crew home. The silence that descended upon the USS Barb was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was not the quiet of stealth or the hush of anticipation, but the deep, breathless stillness of a predator that had struck and now lay coiled, waiting for the echo of its own blow. The submarine hung in the dark water, suspended between the ocean floor and the surface, a steel ghost holding its breath. The only sounds were the subtle, internal rhythms of the boat, the low hum of the circulation pumps, the faint creak of the pressure hull adjusting to the depth, the almost imperceptible hiss of the air conditioning. These familiar noises, usually a comforting backdrop, now seemed like a countdown, each tick of the machinery measuring the agonizing stretch of time before the promised thunder. In the control room, the atmosphere was thick enough to taste. The red battle lamps cast long, dancing shadows, painting the faces of the crew in hues of crimson and black. The plainsmen stood rigid at their stations, their hands resting lightly on the wheels, their eyes locked on the depth gauges, as if by sheer will they could keep the massive boat perfectly, impossibly still. The sonarman, isolated in his world of sound, had his eyes closed in concentration, his head cocked as he listened to the underwater world. Through his headphones, he was searching for any anomaly, the churn of a patrol boat's screws, the aggressive ping of active sonar, anything that would signal the enemy was stirring. But for now, there was only the natural chorus of the deep, the clicking of shrimp, the distant song of a whale, the empty, vast silence of the sea. To pass the interminable wait, the men began to share stories. They were not tales of grand heroics or past victories, but quiet, personal recollections whispered in the gloom. A young electrician from Kansas spoke of listening for the distant whistle of the Santa Fe freight train from his bedroom window as a boy, a sound that had meant connection to a wider world. Now he was listening for a different kind of train, one whose arrival would mean destruction. A gunner's mate from Brooklyn recalled the time his father's old truck had backfired on a quiet street, the sudden bang causing everyone to jump out of their skin. He wondered aloud if the explosion they were waiting for would feel the same, a sudden, shocking violation of the silence. These shared fragments of other lives, other times, were a lifeline, a way to tether their fraying nerves to a world beyond the pressurized steel tube and the crushing weight of expectation. Through it all, Commander Eugene Fluckey was the picture of calm. He stood near the chart table, his arms crossed, his expression one of relaxed patience. To his crew, he was a rock, an unmovable pillar of confidence. He made a slow circuit of the control room, pausing to lay a steadying hand on a nervous sailor's shoulder, offering a small, confident nod to the executive officer. His presence was a balm, his unwavering demeanor, a silent command to hold fast. But beneath the placid exterior, a storm of turmoil raged. His mind was a relentless calculator, running and rerunning the variables. Had the charge been set correctly? Had the patrol they'd evaded stumbled upon the hidden wires? Was a train even scheduled? What if a maintenance crew found the explosive first? Each unanswered question was a fresh twist of the knife. He felt the weight of every life aboard the Barb, the 8 men who had risked everything on the shore, the entire crew now depending on his judgment in the moments to come. The fear was not for himself, but for them, a cold, sharp dread that this daring gamble might end, not in triumph, but in the crushing silence of failure or the shriek of depth charges. His calm was a performance, the most critical command decision of the mission. A mask he wore to perfection while his inner world screamed with a potent, terrifying mix of anticipation and fear. The sound, when it came, was not the sharp crack of a gunshot or the rolling boom of thunder, but something far more visceral. It was a deep, percussive whump that seemed to originate not from the air or the water, but from the very earth itself. A fundamental tearing of the fabric of the world. The shockwave hit the USS Barb a moment later, a physical force that traveled through the dense medium of the sea and hammered against her steel hull. The entire submarine shuddered, a long, low-frequency groan that vibrated up from the keel and rattled every loose fitting, every tool on a bench, every tooth in a man's head. In the control room, the coffee in a half-full mug sloshed violently over the rim, a dark brown stain spreading across the chart table. The single brutal concussion was followed by a strange, vacuum-like silence, as if the ocean itself had been stunned into momentary submission. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, absolute stillness gripped the crew. Every man froze in place, their tasks forgotten, their minds struggling to process the sensory overload. The sonarman ripped his headphones from his ears, his face a mask of shock and pain from the acoustic violence that had just blasted through them. The plainsman's hands, which had been so steady on the wheels, now gripped them like vices, their knuckles bone-white. The shared, breathless silence was a communal paralysis, the culmination of all the tension, the waiting, the fear compressed into one deafening, undeniable fact. It had worked. The charge had detonated. The train was gone. Then, the spell shattered. A single raw whoop of triumph erupted from a torpedoman in the forward compartment, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. It was the spark that lit the fuse. The cheer that followed was not a coordinated celebration, but a chaotic, explosive roar that erupted simultaneously from 85 throats. It was a sound of vindication, of relief, of savage joy. Men pounded each other on the back, their faces split with wild, disbelieving grins. The controlled, professional atmosphere of the boat dissolved into a moment of primal exultation. They had not just executed a mission. They had done something no American submarine had ever done before. They had killed a train. Commander Fluckey did not join the cheers. He was already at the periscope, his body moving with a fluid, automatic purpose. He slapped the handles down and pressed his eye to the rubber cup. his heart still hammering against his ribs from the force of the blast. The world that swam into view through the lens was one of beautiful, terrifying chaos. On the distant shore, a pillar of dirty orange fire clawed at the sky, its base obscured by a boiling black cloud of smoke and pulverized earth. Smaller, secondary fires dotted the landscape around it, scattered pieces of the train burning like fallen stars. Through the shimmering heat haze, he could see the frantic, ant-like scurrying of Japanese soldiers, their searchlights stabbing uselessly into the smoke, illuminating nothing but their own confusion and panic. The neat, orderly railway line was now a scene of apocalyptic wreckage, a twisted sculpture of steel and splintered wood. The impact of their action was laid bare, a raw, physical testament to the destructive power they had unleashed. But as he watched the distant flames dance, a colder, quieter emotion settled over Fluckey, tempering his satisfaction. This was not a ship sinking in open water, a faceless enemy vanishing beneath the waves. This was devastation on land, a tangible burning scar that spoke of lives lost, of a supply line severed, of the brutal, intimate weight of the war they were waging. The moral gravity of their success pressed down on him, as real and as heavy as the deep, dark water surrounding his boat. The world did not end with a bang, but with a shattering. For the Japanese sentry perched in his wooden watchtower overlooking the Karafuto coast, the night had been a monotonous tapestry of wind-whipped pines and the distant rhythmic sigh of the surf. His thoughts were miles away, in a warm house in Hokkaido, when the horizon to the south erupted. There was no warning, no rising plume of smoke or precursor flash, just a sudden, sun-bright flower of orange and yellow that bloomed silently for a fraction of a second before the sound hit him. It was a physical blow, a deep, gut-punch crump that slammed against the tower and vibrated up through the soles of his boots. The glass in his field, glasses rattled in his hands. For a moment, he could only stare, his mind, perfect, empty void, unable to process the impossible violence that had just torn a hole in the familiar darkness. Confusion was the first and only universal reaction. In the small garrison headquarters a mile inland, a young lieutenant spilling tea on a logistics report. In a coastal pillbox, a machine gun crew playing a quiet game of cards. In the barracks, men jerked from the edge of sleep. All were frozen by the same singular question. It was not an air raid. There had been no drone of engines, no shriek of falling bombs. It was not naval artillery. The sea remained a dark, empty plain. This was something else, something alien and terrifying in its inexplicability. The initial silence that followed, the blast was more deafening than the explosion itself, a vacuum of understanding filled only by the frantic rising hammer of their own hearts. Then the alarms began to wail, their electronic screams cutting through the night, jerking the garrison from its stupor into a chaotic, disjointed scramble. The response was instinctive, a drill practiced but never truly believed. Great, glaring eyes of light stabbed out from the coastline, powerful searchlights mounted on trucks and fixed emplacements. Their beams, usually methodical and sweeping, now jerked and danced with a frantic, panicked energy, slashing across the black water, probing the empty beaches, illuminating the dense inland forest. The beams crossed and recrossed, creating cages of light in the darkness, but they found nothing. No enemy fleet lurked offshore. No paratroopers drifted down from the empty sky. No saboteurs were caught frozen in the act of fleeing. The lights illuminated only what they had always illuminated: the churning, indifferent sea, and the dark, impenetrable wall of trees. The searchlights were a gesture of defiance against the unknown, a desperate attempt to impose order on a situation that defied all logic. They swept over the very stretch of beach where 8 men had landed hours before, over the forest path they had used and found only the undisturbed night. The futility of the initial search was absolute, a pantomime of security that served only to highlight how completely and how silently they had been breached. The enemy was a ghost, his work done, his presence already a memory, and the frantic sweeping lights illuminated nothing but the depth of their own ignorance and alarm. The frantic sweep of searchlights gave way to a more deliberate, ground-shaking response. Orders, sharp and laced with a panic that protocol could not disguise, sent squads of Japanese soldiers spilling from their barracks. They formed up in the chaotic glow of truck headlights and the distant, flickering fire on the horizon, their breath pluming in the cold air, their faces set in masks of confusion and burgeoning fear. These were not the seasoned veterans of the Pacific fronts. They were garrison troops, men accustomed to the dull rhythm of sentry duty and the abstract notion of a war fought far away. The explosion had ripped that illusion to shreds, replacing it with a tangible burning threat in their own backyard. The search parties, armed with rifles and bayonets fixed, moved out in a ragged skirmish line, their boots crunching through the undergrowth as they advanced toward the source of the cataclysm. Their progress was slow, hampered by the darkness and a creeping, paralyzing caution. Every shadow seemed to hold an ambush, every snapped twig the footfall of an unseen enemy. They reached the railway embankment, not as hunters, but as men walking into a trap whose nature they could not comprehend. The scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The rails were twisted into grotesque, modern art sculptures, torn from their wooden ties and flung aside like discarded toys. The ground was scorched black for yards in every direction, littered with smoldering fragments of wood and jagged, smoking metal. The centerpiece of the destruction was the shattered hulk of the locomotive, its boiler torn open, its innards spilled across the track in a geyser of steam and coal. Behind it, freight cars lay on their sides, their contents crates of ammunition, sacks of rice, bundles of uniforms scattered and burning, creating a hellish, flickering landscape. The air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite, burned coal, and something darker, a sweet, sickly smell that turned the stomach. The soldiers fanned out, their bayonets pointing at nothing, their eyes wide, with a horror that was as much about the method as the result. There was no enemy to fight, no position to storm. They poked through the wreckage, their movements hesitant, as if the very ground might be seeded with more of the invisible, patient death that had claimed the train. They found the epicenter of the blast quickly enough, the crater where the charge had been, the shredded remains of the pressure trigger mechanism gleaming in the firelight. A young officer, his face smudged with soot, knelt and picked up a piece of the insulated wire, holding it up as if it were a serpent from a myth. The understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. This was not an act of God or a mechanical failure. It was sabotage, deliberate, calculated, and executed with a chilling precision right under their noses. The saboteurs had been here, on this very spot, touching their rails, hiding their weapon in the gravel, and then they had vanished, leaving only this carnage as their calling card. The realization sent a new, different kind of alarm through the ranks. If the raiders could do this, they could be anywhere. They could be watching them from the tree line at that very moment. The search, which had been focused on the immediate area of the blast, now expanded outward in frantic, disorganized waves. Soldiers crashed through the forest, their shouts echoing pointlessly in the vast darkness, their flashlights creating bobbing pools of light that revealed only endless, identical trees. They swept the coastline, their beams stabbing out over the empty, mocking sea. But the raiders were gone, their trail cold, their escape as perfect as their attack. The frantic efforts of the Japanese garrison were a ballet performed for an empty theater, a testament to the ghost-like evasion of the saboteurs and the stunning, humiliating success of the operation. The only trace of the enemy was the destruction he had wrought, a silent, burning monument to his audacity and their own failure. The celebration aboard the USS Barb was a brief, bright flare in the deep, cold dark, extinguished the moment the first, aggressive ping of enemy sonar echoed through the hull. It was a sound, like a 5 pebble dropped into a deep well, a sharp, metallic note that sliced through the lingering euphoria and replaced it with an ice-water clarity. The party was over. The hunt was on. Commander Fluckey's voice, calm but edged with steel, cut through the control room. All ahead flank. Take her down to 200 feet. Rig for depth charges. The orders were not shouted, but they carried the weight of a slamming door. In an instant, the submarine transformed from a vessel of triumph into a creature of pure flight. The deck plates began to thrum as the electric motors poured every ounce of their power into the screws. The Barb shuddered, then surged forward, her bow digging into the water as she dove for the depths. The angle was sharp, pressing the crew against bulkheads and forcing them to brace themselves at their stations. The world outside the pressure hull became a roaring black torrent as the boat accelerated to its maximum underwater speed, a desperate sprint away from the site of their audacious strike. Inside, the atmosphere was one of intense, focused silence, broken only by the hum of the motors, the rush of water, and the steady, terrifying ping, ping, ping of the Japanese destroyer's sonar, a relentless heartbeat tracking their flight. The enemy was no longer confused. The massive explosion had been a beacon, drawing every warship in the vicinity like sharks to blood. Through the hydrophones, the sonarman tracked the high-pitched whine of multiple sets of screws, churning the water above and behind them. The destroyer was the lead hunter, its sonar pings growing sharper, more defined, as it gained a solid fix on their position. Deeper, heavier engine noises suggested a frigate or a corvette moving to cut off their escape. The Barb was a mouse in a maze, and the cats had just been let in. In the maneuvering room, the engineer and his team became the unsung heroes of the escape. Their world was a cacophony of straining machinery and the smell of hot ozone. The demand for flank speed pushed the electrical systems to their absolute limit. Ammeters quivered deep in the red, and the temperature in the cramped compartment began to climb dangerously. The engineers moved with a frantic, precise dance, monitoring gauges, adjusting rheostats, bypassing overtaxed circuits. A wisp of smoke curled from an overloaded junction box. An electrician, his face sheened with sweat, smothered it with a fire blanket before it could blossom into a catastrophe. Their efforts were a battle against physics itself, a race to keep the power flowing without melting the very wires that carried it. The survival of the boat and every man aboard depended on their ability to keep the motors turning, to maintain the desperate, lung-bursting pace of their flight through the lightless depths, a testament to escape and survival against impossible odds. The USS Barb was a vessel of two worlds, a schism of emotion held together by a steel pressure hull. Aft, in the cruise, mess, and the torpedo rooms, the air was thick with the smell of reheated coffee and the electric buzz of triumph. Men who had spent hours clenched in a fist of tension now laughed with a raw, relieved abandon, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of celebration. They slapped the backs of the 8 raiders who sat wrapped in blankets like returning kings, their faces still smudged with grease paint and exhaustion, but their eyes shining with a fierce, hard-won light. A bottle of medicinal brandy, produced from some hidden stash, made a furtive round, each sip a burning toast to the train that was now scrap metal and to the crew that had killed it. The shared experience bound them tighter than any regulation, a fraternity forged in risk and sealed by success. But forward, in the officers' wardroom, the atmosphere was one of clinical dissection. The celebration was a distant hum, a background noise to the quiet, intense conversation happening around the chart table. Fluckey stood with his key officers and the raiders, the after-action report taking shape in his precise handwriting. He led the debrief, not as a celebrant, but as a surgeon, probing the mission's anatomy with a cool, analytical eye. He questioned every detail, from the exact timing of the patrol's passing to the consistency of the soil where the wire was buried. He analyzed the risks they had run, the sheer, blinding luck of the searchlight missing the boats, the agonizing proximity of the foot patrol, not to diminish their success, but to codify it, to extract every possible lesson from the razor's edge they had walked. The successes were noted with a curt nod, the flawless navigation, the perfect placement of the charge, the impeccable silence and discipline during the withdrawal. Fluckey's calm assessment was a grounding force, a reminder that their victory was not just a matter of courage, but of calculation, preparation, and a healthy dose of audacious luck. Later, in the quiet corners of the boat, the raiders themselves shared their experiences in hushed, more personal tones. Huddled near the humming machinery of the engine room or sitting on their bunks, they pieced together the mosaic of the night from individual fragments of memory. The demolitions expert, Paul Saunders, spoke not of the explosion, but of the terrifying, delicate intimacy of arming the charge, his world reduced to the feel of the springs and the sound of his own heartbeat. The lead scout recounted the moment he first saw the rails, not as a target, but as a deadly, gleaming snake in the grass. The young gunner's mate, who had whispered the joke about the train's timing, found his words had already become part of the boat's lore, a symbol of the grim humor that had kept their nerve from shattering. They reflected on the lessons learned, the absolute necessity of patience, the value of perfect silence, the profound trust required to place your life in the hands of the man next to you in the dark. And they did not shy away from the cost. The celebration could not entirely mask the somber understanding that their audacity had a price. The distant secondary fires they had seen through the periscope were not just burning wood and metal. They were supplies that would never reach Japanese soldiers, a small but tangible shift in the war's balance. The twisted locomotive was a tomb for its crew, a fact that sat heavily in the quiet moments between the jokes and the backslaps. Their success was a testament to American ingenuity and nerve, but it was also a stark reminder of the war's brutal personal arithmetic. They had gambled with their lives and won, but the ghost of that wager, the chilling memory of how close they had come to the abyss, would linger long after the brandy was gone and the cheers had faded, a permanent part of the legacy they now carried within them. Alone in the red-lit quiet of the conning tower, with the hum of the electric motors a constant hymn in his ears, Commander Eugene Fluckey allowed the full weight of the past hours to settle upon him. The Barb was deep now, running silent and fast away from the coast of Karafuto, the frantic pings of the enemy's sonar fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the sea. The immediate, gut-clenching fear of the depth charge escape was receding, replaced by a profound, almost weary clarity. He thought of the charge, nestled against the cold steel of the rail, a patient, mindless predator waiting for the weight of an entire train to trigger its purpose. He thought of the 8 men, his men crawling through the surf and the dark forest, their every sense stretched to the breaking point. And he thought of the thunderclap, that single, shattering note of confirmation that had vibrated through the very bones of his boat. This was more than just another sunk tonnage added to their tally, another line in a patrol report. This was something entirely new, a unique and bizarre footnote in the sprawling, bloody history of the war, America's only submarine train kill. The phrase itself felt incongruous, almost laughable. Submarines were creatures of the deep, hunters of ships, leviathans of the abyss. They were not meant for commando raids on solid ground, for creeping through pine forests to ambush locomotives. The entire operation had been an act of pure improvisation, a testament to the belief that in the war's desperate endgame, the rules were not just meant to be bent, but shattered completely. It was a symbol of the kind of nerve that defined their service, not just the courage to face enemy fire, but the audacity to conceive of the impossible and then to execute it with cold, precise efficiency. The legacy of the raid, Fluckey knew, would not be measured in the strategic value of a single destroyed train. Significant as that was to the enemy supply line, its true impact was more subtle, more psychological. It was a demonstration that there was no sanctuary, no place so far behind the lines that the war could not reach. The Barb had brought the fight to the enemy's doorstep, not with a barrage of shells, but with a handful of men and a few blocks of explosives, proving that ingenuity could be a more devastating weapon than sheer force. It was a blow against the enemy's sense of security, a whisper in the dark that told them even their home territories were vulnerable. In the grand, grinding narrative of the Pacific War, this single quirky operation was a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare, a statement that American resolve was limited only by the imagination of its commanders and the nerve of its sailors. As the Barb carved her way through the lightless water, putting mile after safe mile between herself and the burning coast, Fluckey felt a quiet, unshakable pride. It was a pride not in his own planning, but in the men who had breathed life into his audacious scheme. They had been submariners, electricians, and machinists one moment, and shadow warriors the next. They had carried the weight of the mission on their shoulders, and had not faltered. The legacy of the raid was theirs, a story of trust forged in darkness, of teamwork tested to its absolute limit, and of a courage that was both quiet and breathtakingly bold. It was a legacy that would outlast the war, a testament to the fact that sometimes history is not made by armies clashing on great fields, but by 8 men in a rubber boat, paddling toward a hostile shore under a fickle moon, their success hinging on nothing more and nothing less than their own unwavering nerve.